Thank you. A little different than the previous presentations. It'll be a little drier because I'm talking about the historiography and not so much about what the actions are. The Underground Railroad is a quintessential American story. We are attracted to the underdog, the valiant resistor of the societal norms. In the 1930s, gangsters such as John Dillinger, Al Capone, or Slick Willie Wilson, or Sutton, you know him, Slick Willie? Why do you rob banks? Because it's where the money is. They captured the public's admiration as did Billy the Kid, Jesse James, or Wyatt Earp in the 19th century. For different reasons, the exploits of the Underground Railroad have long been of interest to academic and non-academic circles. While recognition of the injustice of an economic system that enslaved millions is readily absorbed, little or no attention is paid to contributing factors such as the complicity of the North in a slave system that furnished raw materials for New England textile mills or New England shipbuilders and insurance companies that reaped considerable profits, sustaining and abetting the transatlantic trade in human flesh. The Underground Railroad appeals to our sense of morality that urges assistance to the downtrodden and the abused. Helping the underdog is an essential component in our belief in American exceptionalism. That belief has led to a reinterpretation of historical events. During my school years, slavery was relegated to the footnotes of our American history textbooks, or mentioned in passing as an institution that had succumbed to the march of progress. Prior to the Civil Rights Movement, and an agitation for veracity in historiography, which is somewhat trivialized in today's slogan, Black Lives Matter, students of American history were presented with a sanitized and almost vanilla version of America. The conflict between these two approaches can be seen in the first studies published on that almost mythical event called the Underground Railroad. In 1883, soon after the death of its author, Robert C. Smedley, the Underground Railroad in Chester and surrounding counties was edited and published by friends of the author, Marianna Gibbons and Robert Purvis. Both editors had impeccable credentials in regards to the Underground Railroad. Marianna Gibbons was the daughter of Dr. Joseph Gibbons and the granddaughter of Daniel Gibbons, residents of Lancaster County's Bird in Hand, who had continued their respective fathers' activity of assisting Africans escaping bondage. According to most accounts, these anti-slavery activities of the Gibbons family began soon after the American Revolution and continued up to the Civil War. Daniel Gibbons kept the records of those whom he had helped, and according to his granddaughter, when the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 made such information dangerous, he destroyed his records, which include references to about 1,000 individuals. Robert Purvis was, according to contemporary parlance, of mixed race because of his British father and a mother who was a free woman of color of Moroccan and Jewish descent. Born in South Carolina, Robert Purvis accompanied his family to Philadelphia and received an elite education. He likely attended the Amherst Academy, a secondary school in Amherst, Massachusetts. He married Harriet Fortin, the daughter of James Fortin, the free African entrepreneur, who became quite wealthy after the Revolution. Left wealthy by his father's death, Robert and his two brothers shared an estate worth $250,000 in the 1820s. Despite, or perhaps because of his wealth, Robert Purvis became engaged in the questions that dominated public opinion in the early republic, slavery. He was a co-founder with William Lloyd Garrison of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia, which pursued the radical course of demanding immediate emancipation of all enslaved Africans. Purvis also helped establish the Library Company of Colored People in 1833, and when the new state constitution limited the right to vote to white men in 1838, Purvis was among the leadership of those who protested this injustice. Together with Marietta Gibbons, Robert Purvis provided both theoretical and practical knowledge of the workings of the Underground Railroad. Purvis was acquainted with abolitionists in Lancaster County, such as William Wright, and his home, located outside of Philadelphia, was a station on the Underground Railroad where he was able to help, as he later estimated, one freedom seeker per day from 1831 to 1861. That's 9,000 individuals. In a preface, Smedley addressed the genesis of his book. He had originally intended to write a newspaper article on the topic about 1880, a time when county historical societies were being formed, perhaps to preserve the nation's historical memory after the cataclysm of the Civil War. When he submitted what he had written to an agent who had given him some information, more names were suggested, and further research caused him to expand and intensify his study. Without being necessarily intentional, Smedley draws on his contacts in the Society of Friends to document anti-slavery activity in and around Chester County. As he noted in his first chapter, and I quote, "The Friends of University of Liberty assumed very little antagonism towards it," that is slavery, until some cases of kidnapping and shooting of fugitives who attempted to escape occurred in Columbia, Pennsylvania in 1804. This incited the people of that town, who were chiefly Friends or their descendants, to throw around the colored people the arm of protection, and even to assist those who were endeavoring to escape from slavery to a section of the country where they might be free. This gave origin to that organized system of rendering aid to fugitives, which was afterward known as the Underground Railroad. End of quote. Smedley may here be accused of finding what he set out to find. His informants, we presume, were, as he notes, either members of the Society of Friends or descendants of members. Looking back over more than 3/4 of a century, events can be conflated. Smedley and his editors state 1804 as the year in which Columbia resident Thomas Bowen, a Revolutionary War hero and a member of the county elite, purchased the time of Stephen Smith, a young African living in Pakistan in today's Harrisburg. Not included in the sale was Stephen's mother, who, as the story goes, ran away to join her son in Columbia. A daughter of the Cochran family, her owners, pursued her and attempted to recapture her in Bowen's kitchen. The ensuing melee allegedly persuaded Columbians to assist other Africans held in bondage. What is problematic about Smedley's account is the chronology and essential facts. He states that Stephen Smith was an enslaved African, but being born presumably in 1796, according to then state law, he would have been an indentured servant whose time of service was limited, 28 years. Also, it is generally accepted that Smith was 5 years of age when his time was purchased by Bowen. Therefore, the date of his purchase would have fallen in 1801 and not in 1804. Additionally, there is very little evidence of shootings and kidnappings until the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. The source of Smedley's information about Columbia may well have been the collective memory of the individuals he interviewed or the real-life experiences of Marietta Brubaker and Robert Purvis. But there's another possible source. An allusion to Columbia's role in the Underground Railroad was first mentioned by Samuel Evans in his May 17, 1870 article published in the Daily Evening Express with the title of Recollections of Slavery. There, Evans referenced an event that occurred about 1810 when William Wright, the grandson of John Wright, who named the county after his home in England, thwarted Charles Sewall by testifying and having Sewall's enslaved Africans set free. Sewall had moved to Lancaster County from Hartford County, Maryland, with 9 men whom he claimed as his property. William Wright brought suit against Sewall and testified that the enslaved Africans should be free because of a provision of the 1780 Gradual Abolition Act which freed enslaved Africans brought to Pennsylvania and who took up residence here. The limit was 6 months. After 6 months, they were free. Angered by the loss of his perceived property, Sewell chased Wright on horseback from Lancaster to the area of Columbia, where the rather petite Wright was able to elude his tormentor. He was a little faster. Evans' information was gleaned from his own experiences and the fact that he was born near Columbia in 1825 and served almost half a century as Justice of the Peace there. It is probable that he was personally acquainted with many of the people that he mentions in his narrative. Unlike Smedley's later work, Evans' 1870 article emphasizes a point that the National Park Service only recently presents as factual: the central role played by free and enslaved Africans in the Underground Railroad. Smedley mentions William Whipper and Stephen Smith only in passing. Evans goes into greater detail to mention Cato Jordan, Thomas Bessick, and others who were active in the effort to assist and protect freedom seekers. The best source for presenting Black voices of the Underground Railroad was William Still's 1872 documentation, The Underground Railroad. Still, 1821 to 1902, was the son of formerly enslaved Africans, and in 1847, he came to Philadelphia to work for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, he assumed the chairmanship of his Vigilance Committee. He was charged with keeping a record of his activities, and this he did in a manner which likely exceeded the expectations of his employers. They probably wanted him to keep a list of the expenses. What he did was he listed everyone who came, how they escaped, and what path they took. That information was potentially dangerous, not only to Still, but also to the freedom seeker and everyone who had helped along the way. Avoiding detection, Still published what is the most unique perspective of the Underground Railroad. Smedley mentions Still several times, but without any explanation other than stating that this or that person came to him for help. When the Lancaster County Historical Society decided in 1911 to commemorate what was still termed the Christiana Riot of 1851, characteristically, emphasis was placed on the role played by Quakers in that resistance against the enforcement of what many felt was an immoral law. Mariana Gibbons, now Mariana Brubaker, provides a comprehensive overview of the workings of the Underground Railroad in Lancaster County, but mentions William Whipper and Stephen Smith only in passing, and states that Still's book is not useful in her specific context. She lists primarily the quick participants in the clandestine activity, along with a solitary German. That solitary German was named Eschel, and his descendants still live in Lancaster. The exclusion of Black agency by Smedley and later by Mariana Brubaker should not be necessarily perceived as a deliberately racist, but more as an attempt to explain the involvement of family and friends in a historical movement. That Blacks could have played a more than secondary role in that movement never occurred to these chroniclers. That should not diminish the utility of what they produced. Smedley, and by inference, Mariana Brubaker, have produced a history of Quaker involvement in the Underground Railroad. A question which cannot be definitively answered is, what did Robert Purvis contribute? He knew most of the main participants in the local anti-slavery community and was himself, as he stated later, deeply involved in that activity. Why did he not elaborate more about the involvement of William Whipper and other free Africans? It is noteworthy that if, as Smedley, Evans, and later Brubaker assert, Columbia was the single most important community in Lancaster County for the Underground Railroad, then William Still's inclusion of William Whipper as the only witness from Columbia should have made the analysis of Black involvement a priority. The exclusion of the Black voice is also manifest in the first history of the Underground Railroad, prepared by a trained academic historian. Wilbert Henry Siebert's The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom, A Comprehensive History, 1898, is remarkable because of the training and dedication of Siebert, a scholar at Ohio State University, brought to the task at hand. Siebert lived from 1866 to a surprising 1961. He was the son of German immigrants. He graduated from Ohio State in 1888 and in 1889 from Harvard, where he also earned his master's in 1890. From 1890 to 1891, he studied in Germany. Inquiries at the Ohio State Archives and the archives at Harvard University have provided a little insight into Siebert's educational path. Albert Bushnell Hart, the Harvard professor who is characterized as belonging to the first generation of professional American historians, wrote the introduction to Siebert's book. Like most academicians in 19th century America, Hart had studied in Germany or had been taught by German academics. Hart studied at the University of Freiburg, and his doctoral advisor was Hermann Eduard von Holtz. When Siebert spent his year abroad, he studied at Freiburg and also at the University of Berlin, today's Humboldt University. Reportedly, his teachers in Germany were Hermann Eduard von Holtz, Alois Riel, a neo-Kantian philosopher at Freiburg, Hugo Münsterberg, a privat docent. A privat docent is a professor who's not paid by the university. He gets money from the students at Freiburg, who later brought his special brand of psychological research, thanks to William James, to Harvard. Other teachers of Siebert were Erich Marx, history professor at Freiburg, and in Berlin, in Berlin, not Berlin, Heinrich von Treitschke. There's an interesting person. How many of you have heard of Heinrich von Treitschke? Sure. Von Treitschke was a noted nationalist, anti-Semite, racist, militarist, and colonialist who thought Africans were inferior to Europeans. Siebert studied under von Treitschke, as did another of Hart's students, W.E.B. Du Bois. Hart himself reportedly believed blacks to be inferior, but he apparently did not want them denied access to the fruits of education. Besides Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, the creator of the oldest Black history organization in America, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, was also Albert Bushnell Hart's doctoral student. Since Hart wrote the introduction to his book, and Siebert studied under Hart's Doktorvater, it seems likely that Siebert was one of Hart's students. Harvard didn't know this. Siebert never acquired the doctorate. Excuse me. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by his home institution, the Ohio State University. He was a proponent of the German school of historiography. That is a determination to collect and assemble every possible bit of information about a social phenomenon with the goal of explaining how it came to be. Or as a friend of mine, Dennis Dowling, once said, from Plato to NATO. Siebert's interest in the Underground Railroad excuse me, was more than just academic. He lived to be 95 years of age. And in 1951, at the age of 85, he published Mysteries of the Underground Railroad in Ohio. He created an archive of materials related to the Underground Railroad that is now available online. I've looked at this, fantastic. That reflects a lifelong research interest. Prior to the publication of his comprehensive history, he authored an article in the 1896 edition of the American Historical Review, in which he outlined his sources and methodology for research. He named four books. The Reminiscences of Levi Coffin, William Still's Underground Railroad, Smedley's History, and a volume by Reverend William M. Mitchell titled The Underground Railroad, 1860, as his primary source materials, and stated that a history of the Underground Railroad must be written out of the recollections of the abolitionists. Of those, Mitchell was a fugitive slave himself. Accordingly, from 1892 to 1896, Siebert did field work collecting 2,500 written or dictated statements. He visited sites in Ohio, southern Michigan, and, quote, among the surviving fugitives along the Detroit River in Canada West. In other words, he probably went to Buxton, St. Catharines in Ontario. Siebert found materials relating to anti-slavery activity in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maine, comprehensively. He found escape routes that covered 1/4 of the United States, extending to the Carolinas, Tennessee, and in rare cases from the far south. His focus in this early essay was Ohio, but he stated that similar routes could be found in Pennsylvania. Siebert thus prepared the way for what he termed a comprehensive history. The results were impressive and resulted in a resource that is still useful today. Besides outlining sources of the history of the Underground Railroad, Siebert also details its origin and growth, fugitive settlers in the northern states, the prosecution of Underground Railroad men, the Underground Railroad in politics, and finally its effect. The volume contains a number of illustrations, portraits, facsimiles, and maps. Siebert also added important appendices in which lists of constitutional provisions and national acts relative to the fugitive slaves, 1787 to 1850, a list of the important fugitive slave cases, figures from the United States Census reports relating to fugitive slaves, a 22-page bibliography of relevant sources, and a directory of the names of Underground Railroad operators and members of vigilance committees. The latter list for our county contains 31 names, and perhaps characteristically, all men. Free Africans Thomas Bessick, William Whipper, and Stephen Smith are listed, but only Alfred Whipper, a relative of William, who taught school in Canada, is actually listed in the book. Siebert's comprehensive history is in regard to Black agency disappointing and seems to ignore the role women played in the harboring and nurturing of the freedom seekers. It is doubtful that men would have prepared meals and acquired clothing for the often destitute fugitive who came to their doors. They don't sew. Before turning to more recent works, let me mention a book that I only recently discovered. In 1941, Henrietta Buckmaster published Let My People Go. The book carries the subtitle, The Story of the Underground Railroad and the Growth of the Abolition Movement. The 1991 edition, published by the University of South Carolina Press, contains a new introduction by historian Darlene Clark Hine, who lauds it as, quote, a magisterial synthesis of momentous events that led to a Civil War Holocaust and a turbulent reconstruction is history at its compelling best, end quote. It is also described as Afrocentric, as indicated by its 1943 title when published in England as Out of the House of Bondage, the story of the famous Underground Railroad of the American Negro slaves. At a time when professional historians deplored Reconstruction as a misguided and unsuccessful social experiment, and public dialogue was shaped by the mythology of the lost cause, which found expression in many Hollywood films, beginning with Birth of a Nation and including Gone with the Wind, Buckmaster offers a counter-narrative that emphasizes Black agency. Born Henrietta Henkel in Cleveland, in 1909, she attended Friends Seminary and the Brearley School, an all-girls private school in New York's Upper East Side. Despite, or perhaps because of her background, she's an elite, she became involved in the civil rights movement and was awarded a Guggenheim in 1944 with help from W.E.B. Du Bois. The theme which is found in her works is human freedom, and she focuses on marginalized groups such as Africans and women. You can buy the book at the Lancaster History Camp in the bookstore, the reprint. Recent histories such as Fergus Border, which is Bound for Canaan, 2005, Eric Foner's Gateway to Freedom, 2015. Scott Mingus's The Groundswell of 2016. Or RGM Blackett's The Captive's Quest for Freedom, 2018. All emphasize the importance of our region in the development and operation of the Underground Railroad. It is fashionable to identify first in any historical event. Levi Coffin, 1798 to 1877, was active in Underground Railroad activity in Indiana, and he published a memoir in 1876. And he has been called the president of the Underground Railroad. It is important, however, to note that his activity begins about 1847, decades after such activity occurred in our area. Chronology is not as significant as the personnel involved in this resistance. It seems very clear that enslaved Africans in many cases found their own way to freedom following rumors and traditions about a promised land in the North. Attention is only now being focused on the path to freedom that led the enslaved South. Florida, until the Seminole Wars, was a haven for freedom seekers from Georgia. A recent documentary on PBS chronicled the efforts of Sylvia Hector and John Fernando Weber, I say Weber, he was German, a mixed race couple in Texas who assisted freedom seekers to cross the Rio Grande and find freedom in Mexico. In all of these narratives of the Underground Railroad, it seems that first individuals or group of individuals either found assistance on their trek to freedom or reached their destination without assistance. Organized assistance for freedom seekers was a later development, and especially in our region, members of the Society of Friends played an important role, as did local free Africans. If there is a challenge remaining from the study of the local Underground Railroad, is a need to better explore and develop a coherent narrative about the Black participants in this activity. Despite their notoriety, very little is known about Stephen Smith and William Whipper, beyond snippets of information regarding their business and civic activities. Rumors exist regarding their parentage. Only in the past few years have markers been installed acknowledging the wide-ranging philanthropies of both men. Their departure from Columbia began a generations-long decline in the economy of that borough's Black community. Both owned homes in Philadelphia and Cape May, New Jersey, and enjoyed the company of the day's Black elite, as well as heroes such as Harriet Tubman. The story begins here in Lancaster, but embraces our region and perhaps beyond. It behooves us to fill in the blanks. Thank you. Recently, I couldn't have done it. So, 12 days, I get a new knee. This knee is a year old, this one is deep. So, question. I used a lot of terms in the Graduate Abolition Act. You know what that was, right? Remember what it was? 1780, the Pennsylvania legislature said that slaves or enslaved Africans who were alive then were slaves for life. Their children born after March 1st, 1780 would serve until they were 28 years of age. The idea was after one generation, no more slavery. That was the theory. The practice was not only were the children, but also the grandchildren made indentured servants. So that in 1830, the state Supreme Court had to intervene and said it was never the intent of the original law to create a group or a class of servants in perpetuity. So that ended the indenture. Any other aspects on that same?
The Fugitive Slave Act gets a lot of attention for being a flashpoint, but it was already built into the Constitution. Someone, quote, escaping from labor, LABOUR, from one state into another was supposed to be returned to that state. But what was it about the Fugitive Slave Act that so enraged people, apparently even more than the original existence of that provision in the Constitution?
The slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution. It's the subtext there. It's those who are escaping from labor. What happened? There's a series of events. Williams William Whipper in William Still's book refers to the Prigg case. Edward Prigg was from Harford County, Maryland. His brother was Joseph Prigg, and I think Joseph Prigg owned my fourth grandmother. Her name was Nancy Prigg, and she was enslaved, and my fourth grandfather bought her freedom. But Edward did a favor for a neighbor. The neighbor said, there's this woman in York County who's my property, and I want you to go and bring her back, and she's my property. So he goes to York, kidnaps the woman. He is then charged with kidnapping. Pennsylvania had three personal liberty laws that were passed in the 1820s. This happened in the 1830s. And of course, it caused a problem between Pennsylvania and Maryland. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, to the United States Supreme Court. And they made the decision that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which is built as a part of the Constitution, is valid, but states don't have to enforce it. Federal government does. So that was something for the North, and it's something that still irritates the South. What happens with the Fugitive Slave Act, up until the Fugitive Slave Act, those people were leaving. How many escaped on the Underground Railroad? No. Larry Garrett, in his Liberty Line, 1961, estimates maybe 50,000, which doesn't seem like a minute, because you read the story, you think, well, millions of people escaped. 50,000 is still quite a dent in the labor force. And so the South was able to convince the North to pass this law. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was obnoxious because not only did it provide for the retrieval of fugitives, it compelled those who saw them to help. If you did not help capture the fugitive, you could be charged a fine of $1,000, which meant that you couldn't pay it. Poverty, as was the old saying, poverty is not sin, it's just uncomfortable. Well, in the 19th century, that's what our house was used for. You could pay your debts up there, and you were charged to live there, and it led to your being there forever. And when you died, they buried you in the potter's field. So this really enraged them, and of course the Christiana resistance, which is what we call it now. Edward Gorsuch, with the help of the marshal from Lancaster, he got tipped that 3 of his property were in a house near Christiana, the house of William Parker. And so he goes and demands to return. Casper Handley, labor living in the neighborhood, comes and says, stop, and refuses to help. He and a number of others are prosecuted. Gorsuch is killed. His son is seriously wounded. One account says they took 80 bullets out of his body. Buckshot. And of course, it led to this trial. And of course, Matthew Stevens was involved as the defense attorney. And they were found not guilty of, they were charged with treason against the United States. And the argument was, how does one Quaker and these blacks, how could it be that you're taking up arms against the United States? Jury laughed. And then they were tried for murder. That enraged the South. That's what leads to eventually the Civil War. And you know, of course, that Edward Gorsuch's son had a friend who was very wounded that his friend's father was killed this way. John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth killed Lincoln because he heard Lincoln's inaugural address for the second administration say that he was going to extend the right to vote for blacks. Who do you have?
So how did the slave person escape know where the safe place?
That was the trick. There's all kinds of stories stories about following the drinking board, following the North Star. You also have to remember the black population in Lancaster County, specifically Lancaster County, for the most part came from Maryland and Virginia. So there were probably some family ties there. There are all kinds of myths, about using quilts, but a quilt was something you spent hours and hours on making. Why would you put that out in the brain and so forth? There were probably other ways of knowing where we stayed safe. It was word of mouth in some cases. A few people went south and told. Harry Tubman, for example, I don't know if you saw the show. We could go to on PBS. It was about after the making of Black America, becoming Harry Tubman, it was called. This past Tuesday, they had a program on Frederick Douglass. And I'm thinking, thank you, George Floyd. If George Floyd had been killed, we would have Black History programs in February. Now we have everyone. But no, it was hit and miss. And of course, the other thing is, if I were a fugitive, most people would ask for help. You go for where there's a black community. That's why Columbia is so attractive. By 1850, there were 1,000 blacks living in Columbia. That's 20% of the borough's population. Lancaster County in 1860 had 3,650 blacks. 1,000 lived in Columbia, about 300 in Lancaster, maybe 150 in Marietta, the rest of rural. My family, my father was from East Broomore Township, my mother was born in town, so that was typical. After the Civil War, urbanization and also the people leaving the countryside to go to the cities for jobs, farming changed. So they would look for someone who looked like that, and that wasn't always helpful. You've heard of the Gap Gang? They operated the Gap, and one of the problems with the fugitive slave act was they would find someone who would live by themselves. And it didn't matter whether they were a fugitive or not, they would kidnap them and sell them to get the reward. And of course, they split the reward with the magistrate. It was a court system. Now, the Gap Gang used black spies. They would send them out in black enclaves and look for someone who was not connected just yet. If you take November is the last of our downtown tours. The African American Historical Society of South Central Pennsylvania does Afrocentric tours of downtown Lancaster, and it's going to be the last one. It's the first Saturday. I don't do it anymore because I rarely stay in for more. Part of the beginning of the tour is at the Visitor Center, and at the Visitor Center you learn the story of Robert Boston. Robert Boston was a barber. His parents are buried at my church. I'm a member of Bethel AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, the oldest black church in the county. We were organized in 1817. The building was built that year. I find we paid for it in 1820, but didn't move up with it. And Boston married a woman named Wilhelmina Williams. Anyway, I said it was Williams. Excuse me. They got married at the First Reformed Church, and he was a barber. And somehow he came in contact with Edward Rao. Edward Rao, they published Father Abraham, a Pennsylvania German newspaper. He was a prothonotary part-time constable and a friend of Thaddeus Stevens, and part of Stevens' spies. And he worked for a man named Daniel Hughes. The old newspaper building, East West King Street, that's where Hughes had his office. And Hughes worked for Maryland slave catchers. They would pay him to catch fugitives. He was illiterate, so he hired Ralph to do his correspondence. He didn't realize that Ralph, when he got the news, would go down South Queen Street and tell Stevens. He would leave information at the Vice Tavern and that's how they afford. Ralph tells the story. We know about this because Elwood Bryce, who was editor of the local newspaper, had interviewed Lydia Hamilton Smith, Stephen's housekeeper. He interviewed her in 1883. She died of dementia. And the question was, is there any proof that Patty Stevens was involved in the Underground Railroad? Well, Ralph was the editor of the Mount Chunk Democrat at that time. And he wrote and said, yes, I was his agent. And he says that he worked with Robert Boston and 4 other men. Alexander Hood. Read my articles in the Journal of the Lancaster County Historical Society called about Robert Boston. And apparently, either Ralph or Boston noticed that Hughes was talking to a black man and handed him something. And Ralph says to Boston, I think that's the spot. And Boston said, we'll take care of that. And then it is reported. Ralph said, and that was the last time this fellow was seen. Now the question is, who was in charge? Is it Ralph running the ring, or is it Boston running the ring with the help of Ralph? We don't know. So that was the danger if you're escaping, is finding something safe. That's why the real heroes of the Underground Railroad weren't the Quakers or the Free Blacks. It was Jews. Imagine walking. There's a famous painter who lived in Hollywood. He walked, his family walked from Virginia. And that's quite, I am probably walking from here to the park. Imagine what it was like that.
Right.
Any other questions?
Talk about Dred Scott and that famous decision, because that was another great watershed in this whole thing.
The Dred Scott decision of 1857 is interesting. It's also the reason why the Buchanan Elementary School was changed. The name was changed because James Buchanan, who was president then, talked to his college friend Roger King, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and encouraged him to come to a positive decision. Dred Scott was a free African. Oh no, he was an enslaved African who, like the Graduate Abolition Act, had moved to a free state with his master and said, I'm free now. I've lived here for a year or so. I should be free. Well, it went through the courts to the Supreme Court. And Roger Taney wrote the opinion for the majority. Africans have no rights that a white man is obliged to recognize. It was never the intention of the founding fathers to make African citizens. And that was reinforced, of course, by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, separate but equal. It was not changed until the 20th century with Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a qualification of discrimination. The discrimination here before the Civil War. The interesting thing is, if you look at what life was like in the various sections, life was more integrated in the South. We had slavery there, but whites lived next to the blacks. It was always segregated in the North. And then after the Civil War, it got worse. In Pennsylvania, it was not until the 1870s that blacks could ride in the streetcars in Philadelphia. If you read the life of James W.C. Pennington, he was involved with the case in New York where they were suing the streetcar. And he was a fugitive. His autobiography is called The Fugitive Blacksmith. He was enslaved in Hagerstown, Maryland, and escaped to Adams County to the house of William and Phoebe Wright. William Wright was the cousin of William Wright in Columbia. And they told him how to beat him right. No pun intended. And he went on through Lancaster. I found out talking to Jack Brubaker. Sort of Jack is the step grandson of Marianne Brubaker. Sure enough, Pennington on his way to freedom stayed for a time to burn the hand of Daniel Gibbons in the 1830s. He goes to New York, becomes a minister, and is sent to the World Peace Conference of Paris in 1849. And while he's there, he meets a professor from the University of Heidelberg, professor of theology. And this professor is so taken with his story that he persuades the University of Heidelberg to give Pennington an honorary doctorate in theology. Now, this story was rediscovered 12 years ago by some philanthropist in Heidelberg, and he gave the University Heidelberg money. And every year they have the James W. Pennington Prize. If you go online, you can find it. And last year's conference was held in May or June, and it was both live and online. Because I contacted the University of Heidelberg to find out more about this. And the recipients are asked to give lectures. The first recipient, I think, was an African-American professor from Princeton. The requirement is that you do research in an area important to Pennington. Human freedom, one of the things that he was very much interested in. Even though he was not educated, he didn't have formal education, he was tutored, and he sat in the courses. He wrote a history of people of color, which was and he's a fascinating fellow. You can read about him if you're interested in Frederick Douglass. There's a book called Love Across the Color Line, written by acquaintance of mine. And it talks about Ottilia Assing and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, and his story was on PBS this past Tuesday. Frederick Douglass published his autobiography, My Bondage, My Freedom, in 1845, and get to flee because he said, I was enslaved by the state. And so he went to England. They raised £700 to pay for his freedom. And he decided that he needed allies. He published a second version of his autobiography. And he wanted the Germans to be involved. The 1848ers, the revolution era. Ottilia Assing, who was the niece of Barnhagen Valenza, which means nothing to you. Barnhagen Valenza was one of the important figures in it's called the Young German movement. His wife was more important than he was. Her name was Rahel von Barnhagen. They were Jewish. And they had a literary salon in Berlin. And to that literary salon came all the great thinkers admired from the period. Heinrich Heine, for example. And Ottilia came to the United States specifically to be Douglass. She lived for a while in Hoboken. She met Pennington. And then she moved to Rochester, where Douglass lived, and worked for him for 30 years. Douglass, of course, was married to Anna, who was illiterate, but she was a free Black woman who had taken her money to help Douglass get freedom. Ottilia became Douglass' secretary and secretly hoped that he would marry her when his wife died. But she translated his autobiography into German. It appeared in Hamburg in 1860. And I wrote an article about this. It's in the two Germano-Africains, which is published at the University of Dakar in Senegal. And it's about Douglass's reception. And it's typical that his autobiography, which appears in Hamburg in 1860, is overshadowed by a book that appeared 7 years before, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the reason it was overshadowed is because Uncle Tom's Cabin presented to the Germans an image of Africans that was powerful, whereas Douglass, the man who resists slavery, teaches himself. He was self-taught. He found a book on rhetoric and became probably one of the most knowledgeable speakers of the 19th century. He was the most photographed man of the 19th century. Not man, person of the 19th century. 170, I think, was pictures of him compared to Lincoln's 130. And so what happened? He went through one edition. The book went through one edition in 1860. It went through another edition in 1962. It was published in East Berlin. And of course, there to show the evils of the American system. It had very little impact. Although in his final autobiography that appeared just a couple years before his death, Douglas talks about collecting money from his German friends to help John Brown. John Brown, of course, came to Pennsylvania. He met with William Ripper and others in Chambersburg before going to the arsenal. Harper's Ferry. Has anyone been to Harper's Ferry? There's a wonderful, well, it's been a year since I was there, but I was there in 1991. I was giving a talk at the battlefield, and we took a side trip to the bottom of the hill. Story College is up here, this black normal school. The bottom of the hill, they built a Black History Museum and had newspapers, copies of newspapers from that period. And I found, for example, that during the Gettysburg campaign, Confederates kidnapped 10,000 blacks and sold them into slavery. That's not mentioned in any part of history book, but it's in the newspaper. Any other questions? I can sit here and talk. I was paid to talk.
Do you have any information on the relationship of the underground to the Wash Mountain area south of New Holland?
That's a good question. That's something that I'm also interested in. Welsh Mountain, and I actually have relatives who live in Welsh Mountain. Welsh Mountain was a marine settlement. If you look at the term marine settlement, Richard Price wrote a book 30 years ago about maroons. A maroon settlement was a settlement created by Native Americans, Africans, and disaffected Europeans. And they went away, and you can find them from on the coast, the Atlantic coast from Brazil to New Jersey. Ramapo Mountain people, for example, that's a maroon settlement. But what they did was they protected their own against outsiders. I mentioned Florida. The Seminoles were notorious. That's one of the reasons Andrew Jackson invaded at the behest of Georgia slaveholders. Fugitives go to Florida and hide there. And the reason is that Osceola went to war was because his wife was a fugitive slave from Georgia, and she was kidnapped by the soldiers. And so this settlement, very little has been written about it. There was an article that appeared several years ago in the Philadelphia Inquirer about the mountain. I'm an avid user of Ancestry.com and newspapers.com. On newspapers.com, I pay $58. Shooting, I'm just about short of 800 million newspaper pages. It's a searchable database. And if you want to find talks or information about crime and vice, go to Langston newspaper, put in Bow Hill, North Street, Lancaster, Welsh Mountain. That was what they focused on. They never talked about the poverty, they talked about the crime. One of the most recent crimes, a social worker went there and was killed. I gave a talk at the church of the Apostle there in Marietta Avenue. The person in the audience said, "Yeah, I was the one who drove you there."
Oh, geez.
But no, the Welsh Mountain is one of those areas. And of course, what happened to Welsh Mountain is the same thing that's happening to my old neighborhood. I was born in the Southeast, 7th Ward. I was born in North Street, 419 North Street, grew up to 532 North Street. When I was 12 and a half, we moved to Church Street. I lived at 531 Church Street from 1955 to 2017. I put some money in the house, sold it for $102,000. My father paid $7,000 for it in 1955, but every house was $7,000. The man who bought it from me for 102 sold it for 159. It's back on the market again for 259, and that's what happened at Walsh Mountain. People from the Philadelphia suburbs take their big houses and throw people out. Now, if you look at the newspapers from the 19th century, they say, well, these people, some of them may have been fugitive slaves. There's no proof. And of course, no one would walk around saying with signs saying, I was a fugitive.
Right.
You'll see, if you go through the census, you'll find people before the Civil War who say, I was born in Pennsylvania. And then after the Civil War, they find, oh, they're really from Virginia. Because of the future of slave act, you were liable to be kidnapped, sold into slavery.
Does your Church Street house have a historical marker on it now with your name on it?
So they painted it black.
Ooh. Ooh.
There's several houses in Southeast that painted black. I don't see the aesthetic. Of course, my dad was, form stuff, permanent stuff. Yeah. And actually, it's pretty good. They put it on in 1956 and it's still intact. It's only in the front. The house was built in 1890. And I remember looking at a map, because I was the one who cut the grass. And in the backyard, in the far right-hand corner, was a well. We had a case, a Heisey nursing home. Heisey nursing home, Manos, the halfway house for troubled youth, one of the drugs and so on. That's where Manos began. This next is Save a Life, which is where Acton Street is on South Queen Street. And a man was there working on building a new driveway. And suddenly,
Yep.
there was a well there, and deep as from here to the city.
Oh my gosh.
He was lucky that the power bill was down. They put a whole truck of gravel in it.
Oh my.
So there were wells all around. You may or may not be aware of this. In Lancaster County in 1950, 1% of all the houses had outdoor toilets. Where I grew up on North Street, we had an outdoor toilet. When you only visited in the summertime and springtime, they think the fall, winter.
The house I grew up in, Williamstown, Pennsylvania, had a well in the kitchen floor, but you didn't have to go outside.
So you could slide in.
Yeah.
I visited my father's family's ancestral church in Cumberland County, Rocky Spring Presbyterian. They were Scotsmen, very early, fought in the Revolutionary War. But what surprised me, besides I knew all their names are on the pews, but the last row said Negroes. This is 1700s, like French and Indian war times. So how did they end up in Cumberland County?
Well, you have to remember, who were the slave holders in our area? In southeastern Pennsylvania, before the Revolution, majority of slaves were owned by Quakers. Now, it had nothing to do with their attitude towards Africans. It was economics. The only person who could afford them were those who had money, and before the Revolution, the Quakers.
These were Scots.
Well, after the Revolution, locally, it's the Scotch Irish.
Mhm.
Slave holders. But also, if you go to St. James, Episcopal Church in Lancaster, you look at their history. Matter of fact, it's on their marker. Randy Harris found this information. There's also the history of the church that was published in chart, and it has pews. Everyone had their own pew. They paid for that, and the back bench it was big rows of circles. was a housekeeper of Reverend Bowman, who's buried right next to him, sort of the first.
Hmm.
But the other person there, we haven't been able to find her grave, is Dinah McIntyre. Dinah McIntyre was enslaved by Mattia Slough. Mattia Slough owned the Swan Hotel, which was the Lynch Center. And he obviously freed her at some point. She will outlive him. She died in 1819 at the reported age of 113. She was a fortune teller. And my mother was born in 1912, and her generation referred to the 300 block of West Vine Street as Dinah's Hill, because that's where her house was at the top.
Oh.
She owned 3 lots, a total of amazing 6,000 square foot. She had a couple of dollars in the bank when she died. It was such a remarkable life. It shows up in even in the newspaper published in Reading. They're out of. There still exists at the Reading Eagle. Any questions? Have I exhausted your curiosity?
Yes.
Well, thank you for your.
Hello.